Janina Kura. I'm the Regional Agronomy Leader for Saskatchewan. But for the sake of this call, I am Janina, and I own and operate Barley Farms, which is a little bit ironic. It was pointed out to me the other day that my farm is called Barley Farms, but it's been about 5 years since I've grown barley for the sake of this call. And really just wanting to walk through the steps and best practices on putting in a barley crop, and hopefully address any questions you have. I will share that everyone on the call does have some different perspectives and works in different areas. So what might work in one area might be a little bit different based on weeds or disease or just general best practices. So hopefully we can share with you a lot of the information, but if you want an individualized plan, what we're doing today, reach out to your location sales rep, your market development agronomist, and they can share some better insight as well that specifically is tailored to your own farm. The reason why this call did come about is, as we know, the markets have kind of gone crazy with a lot of crops, but barley has definitely had a fair bit of interest lately, not only on the malt side, but just where feed prices have been at. So not sure, I guess, who on the call has grown barley recently, but I know there's quite a few who maybe have never grown barley. Maybe it's been a few years since you've grown, or you've just joined the call to just learn some tweaks or best practices that you can implement on improving your barley crop going forward. All right, so I'm just going to walk through the things that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to jump into introductions from the expert. So we're going to start off with just choosing the right variety. We're going to talk a little bit markets, a little bit agronomics, seeding for success, so just starting off your crop on the right foot. Fertility, so important considerations for your barley acre when it comes to fertilizer. Pest management, so in crop, what you need to be doing to manage maybe some of those troublesome weeds, especially in a barley crop. We'll talk harvest considerations. This one, a little bit less on the agronomic side, but more just maybe there's a discussion in the chat as well, just what's worked for you or maybe not worked in the past. And then we'll jump into some marketing here at the end. We're hoping to stick to an hour or a little bit over, but we did schedule for an hour and a half just so that there is enough time for questions and we're not feeling like the presentation is rushed. All right, so what I will probably do here now is get the experts on the call who are going to help me, Janina, as we walk through this. So Eric, do you want to kick us off and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Eric Brzeski. I'm an account rep based out of Clavette, Saskatchewan. I've been with Cargill for about 8 years. Majority of my time I've spent buying grain, but I also do sell crop inputs such as fertilizer, chemical, and seed.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Lalit?
Hi, my name is Lalit Ives. I'm the Marketing Development Agronomist for the Northeast. I cover areas from Nipawin all the way back to probably close to Blamake, and I've been involved in agriculture for close to 2 decades.
Great. Thanks, Lalit. Kira, you're up next.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Kira Durston, and I'm the Senior Market Development Agronomist for Moose Jaw Congress. So I cover a lot of the southwest territory. And down here in the south, we grow a lot of different crops, and I actually counted that I scout over 10. So I thought I would jump on the call and give a south perspective.
Scout and advise in over 10 crops, hey, Kira?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Katie?
Yeah, I'm Katie Kettenbaugh. I'm the Market Development Agronomist for Unity and North Battleford. And we grow a lot of barley in my territory. It's kind of a staple up here. So hopefully I can give some useful insights today.
Awesome. Yeah, we put crop fertility, but I know you have experience in all the areas we're going to talk about today. All right. And then lastly, we did put you on the presentation. So if you do have comments or suggestions, questions, please type that in the chat, or yeah, like I said, we will have breaks throughout. All right. Choosing the right variety. Here on my farm, it's been a few years, probably about 5 years since I did grow any type of barley. And so just really looking for some insight on what I should be growing. And, I guess when I pull up the list of potential options, whether to choose feed or malt, I guess that's what I'm just looking for some help today. What variety I can grow, assuming I'm able to get my hands on some barley seed. Eric, did you want to kick us off and just maybe delve into some of the marketing plays here?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess when it comes down to malt varieties, I'll just kind of talk about some of the different varieties that are available and are accepted right now. All 6 of the varieties on the malt side that you're seeing there, they are the recommended varieties by the Canadian Malt Barley Trade Council for this year. When we look at Copeland, Metcalfe, and Synergy, for the most part, have an established demand. Synergy's is maybe a little bit more elastic demand. Copeland right now is the king of barley in Western Canada. It is still desired by maltsters, both domestically and into export markets. Metcalfe it's an older variety. It's moving its way out, and it's not due to lack of demand from maltsters. Any maltster out there, whether it's in China or whether it's in Canada, or anywhere in the world for that matter, will take as much Metcalfe as you guys can possibly grow. But the reality of it is we're just seeing some other varieties that have better agronomics and are performing better in your fields. And essentially, the Western Canadian farmer has pushed Metcalfe a little bit more to the side. And so what we have seen is we've also seen a little bit of shipping start to drop it as the acres have dropped as well. It's difficult when you start to see acres drop on something like Metcalfe to be able to forward plan for to move 2 or 3 or 4 trains throughout the course of the year, especially when we don't know what the quality is going to look like, and we've got a much smaller pool to draw from. So we anticipate the Metcalfe shipping will probably tighten up a little bit more, and Copeland will continue to see consistent market access. Synergy is one of the newer varieties. It's been around for about 5 or 6 years. It had a little bit of a struggle getting established early on. The first couple of years that we came out, we had heavy fusarium pressure, and we did see high levels of omitoxin. So when we had poor quality crops for a couple of years, our maltsters really stepped away from any new varieties or really trying any new varieties at that point. And so it took Synergy a few years to kind of establish its spot in the market. But now it is something that we're seeing demand for. China is looking at it, and they've used it in the past, and it's something that can continue to move. It's a high yielding variety, and a lot of growers really like it. But what we're actually starting to see out of China now too is that Synergy demand will probably be strong again for this upcoming year. They know what it is. They know what they're dealing with. But they are starting to look at some of these new varieties to potentially replace some of the demand on Synergy. And we could see Synergy's demand drop over the next couple of years if something like a Connect or a Bow or a Fraser, some of these new varieties that are high yielding, if they have the malting characteristics that the brewers are looking for or that the maltsters are looking for. When it comes to the last 3 varieties, they are new. Connect has probably been around the longest. I've got a couple of growers myself that have grown it for the last couple of years now, and it seems like it is, out of these 3 between Connect, Bow, and Fraser, it is probably the most established of the 3 new ones from a demand standpoint. Maltsters are very, very happy with how it's been performing. Bow and Fraser, they've come to the market this year. There is definitely a lot of interest from maltsters on these varieties, but they don't have a lot of experience with them. So I think demand for both, really Connect, Bow, and Fraser collectively will really depend on what the quality is like this year. If we have good quality this year, I can definitely see the demand growing for those. If we do have a year where we have tougher time with selection processes, Some of the newer varieties may take a little bit of a backseat to the tried, tested, and true ones.
Great. I just am curious agronomically on just some of the input from the team, what I should look at, maybe some of these newer varieties for the agronomics.
So personally, I mean, I like Connect. It's one of the newer ones. It has a similar malting profile to Metcalf. It has short, strong straws. And of the 6 currently, I mean, top 6 current malting varieties, it's the only one that have a moderate rating to Fusarium head blight. It has very good yield potential. The grains are plump. I've seen it in the field. It yields similarly to Synergy, which is probably the highest yielding malt that's out there, with yields that are going to be comparable to CDC Austenson. So I think Synergy would be a good choice for anyone looking to put a new variety on their farm.
Great.
Yeah, I would kind of just chime in and second that about Synergy. I've got quite a few growers here in the Northwest that are growing it, particularly kind of in that Radisson-Borden area, which would be west of Saskatoon. And I've seen some really good results with that variety. So, and yeah, it just looks great in the field, and generally high yielding without having to, really throw the groceries to it. So I've seen some real success with that variety.
Okay, thank you. So if I, I'm kind of torn between growing one of these newer varieties or sticking with something that's fairly established. Is there anything, that from your perspective on the, say, Copeland side, if I want to stick with, say, a more established market, is there anything wrong with putting Copeland in the ground, in your opinion?
Not from an agronomic perspective, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Katie, not from an agronomic perspective, but if you're looking to push those yields, then yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Just maybe, I don't know, Eric, if you want to comment on this at all.
Yeah, sure. This is the estimated seeded acres year by year for the last 5 years, I guess, from the Canadian Malt Barley Trade Council. And so, I mean, as you can see, really over the last 5 years, Copeland has held its ground or been able to hold on to the vast majority of its acres. We're anticipating that it is probably going to take a little bit of a step back just with some of the newer varieties coming on and more of them. And what we've actually seen is we've seen Synergy acres in the last 2 years displace Metcalf. And I mean, you can see Metcalf has lost over 50% of its acres if you look at what we're forecasting for this year. And we're anticipating that Connect, Embo, Legacy, Heat Fraser, all of these varieties will continue to grow.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you guys have given me some food for thought. I think for the sake of this year, just with my first year entering into barley for a little while, I'm going to stick with Copeland. It does sound like that yield potential is still there in comparison to, say, a Metcalf. And, I do appreciate that flexibility, but I think one standout for me is definitely Connect. I'll keep my eye on maybe if this year does go well, I'll maybe think about growing that variety. All right. I guess the next part that I have questions on is just making sure that the seed I'm putting in the ground, I'm doing everything right. So yeah, if you guys wouldn't mind commenting on yeah, what I should be thinking about, what I should be planning for this spring.
I can kind of touch on this one. So obviously, you're going to want to start out with good quality seed. You're going to want to make sure that you're getting your seed tested and looking for any kind of smuts or any kind of Fusarium graminearum that's present on the seed. You're going to want to look at your germination and your vigor to make sure that it's going to come out of the ground really nice. And then with that information, you can kind of start to develop what kind of seed treatment plan you want. that can really depend on like your programming as far as what fits best with your herbicide options. But another thing like down in the south that we really consider is wireworm concerns, just because our soil tends to be a little bit lighter. It tends to warm up a little bit quicker, and it really depends on the farm on if they seed at the beginning or at the end of their seeding season. But wireworms are really attracted to that scent of the germinating barley seeds, so we tend to have that wireworm conversation as well. Another nice thing is you can kind of consider, do you want to treat your seed yourself, or do you want Cargill to come out and treat it with the storm treater? We do have storm treaters that we bring out to people's farms and treat their seed for them, so that you don't necessarily have to worry about doing that during that busy time of seeding. And then another thing actually that's relatively new that I'll just kind of touch on is we have been starting to play with some biologicals on cereals as well. So that's something. Oops, sorry, I'm echoing here. That's something that you could look at as well, like maybe a bacillus-based bacteria or something like that.
Great. So on the wireworm front, you know, it's been a while since I've grown barley. I have maybe seen some wireworm damage on my wheat that I've put in the ground. So what would some of the seed treatments be that I would use for that?
So there's a couple different options on the market now. So there is the Cruiser Vibrance Quattro. So that Cruiser portion is an insecticide. So you can use that, or there is Raxil Pro Shield. Those products have been on the market for a little bit, and they kind of make the wireworms sleepy. Whereas now there's also products that will actually kill the wireworms. So there is Taraxa FX4, which is a combination of the Taraxa insecticide plus the Ensure cereal. And then if you're looking for a little bit more flexibility, there is also Luma Via CPL. And the Luma Via CPL will help with cutworms if you're worried about cutworms as well.
Okay, great to know. And then what would your threshold be like if I were to test my seed? Say I did have farm kept, or I guess I had concerns about my certified seed. What would the threshold be if say my certified was at 90%? Would you have any concerns with putting that in the ground?
As a 90% germ?
Germ, yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I think as long as I typically like to see like 90% or above, but something else that's a little bit more important to me actually is the spread between germination and vigor. So vigor is how they test it in really harsh conditions. So they'll make it really cold, and then they see how many come up then. And so I don't want to see more than a 10% spread between my germ and my vigor. So if my vigor is 75%, I want my germ to be 85% or greater kind of thing. I don't want it to be higher than that spread.
Seems like maybe that's oh, go ahead, Katie.
The other thing that's available with some seed testing companies, depending on who you're going through, is that you can actually have the seed test done with the seed treatment that you're intending to use, and that can show quite a bit of a difference there too if you're worried about germ and vigor.
Great.
I would say if you're below, you know, if you're much outside of the range of, you know, 90, 80, it's not going to bring it up necessarily a huge amount, typically maybe 10% at the most. So if you're outside of that range where you'd be comfortable within 10%, then adding a seed treatment might not fix that problem, but it is worth having a look at.
Okay, great to know. What about No, go ahead, Kira.
I was going to say, I think for like a minimum germination level, you want to have at least 85%. And I think that's like a rule covered by crop insurance and things like that.
Awesome. Maybe just delving into seeding rates then. Is there kind of a typical seeding rate I should be looking at doing, or what would the process be for that?
I've got lots of like when I hear typical seeding rate, immediately my mind kind of goes 2 bushels. But that being said, I think doing a standardized seeding or a sort of custom seeding rate is a really good idea, depending on the 1,000 kernel weight. There also has been, and sorry, let me back up. It's generally you're aiming for that kind of like, I like about 27 plants per square foot. There is a bit of a wider range for cereals, so some people like to be on the higher end, some like to be on the lower end. There have been some studies looking at if seeding rate affects lodging, and so the thought behind that would be that a higher seeding rate can actually reduce lodging. So there's some work that's being done with that. I am not kind of ready to totally hang my hat on that, but it's something that's interesting if that's a concern of yours. There are other ways to deal with lodging as well, nutritional and plant growth regulator options too. But I do think that it's important to take into account the germ of your seed and also the 1,000 kernel weight when you're planning your seeding rate. And there are lots of online calculators too if you're unsure of how to do that calculation. I know the government of Alberta has one. I think the government of Saskatchewan maybe has one, and it's quite easy. You just put in all the numbers, and it will give you a seeding rate. So I would recommend having a look at that because even changing, by 0.2 or 0.3 of a bushel can have a big impact overall when you're seeding thousands of acres. So.
And just adding on to what Katie says about seeding rate, so because you're aiming for mold, the higher your seeding rate, the better it's going to be, right? Because you're going to minimize the amount of tillers you're getting, and then you'll have a more uniform crop at the end. So you will have to be worried about heads coming up later and things like that. So that's also going to be very important. So the higher you can go, then the better it's going to be for you.
That's a really good point, Lily.
On the seeding rate or the seeding front, or seed treating as well, I noticed this, my neighbor had some smut in their barley this past year. So is that something I should be concerned about?
So last year there was quite a bit of smut on barley. So it's very important when you're getting your seed tested to choose that, full package to make sure you're getting that smut tested, because smut it's a funny thing, right? So it's going to be living in the embryo or inside the seed itself. So you won't actually know if you have an infection until after you have planted. And because all barley varieties are susceptible to smut, then putting on a seed treatment is going to be very key to ensuring that you have a good crop coming out of the ground.
Fantastic. As far as pre-seed burn-off goes, so my agronomist or my salesperson tells me I need to spray some pre-seed product. I'm probably going to be seeding this. I'm hoping early May. I've been told that you have a higher chance of getting malt, getting it off in August. So yeah, what would you guys recommend as a good pre-seed before barley?
There's quite a few options available. Generally for pre-burns, for the most part, anything that you can use ahead of wheat, you can use for barley. Of course, always check the label, but as a general rule of thumb, that's kind of how it goes. So my follow-up question, Janina, Ms. Grower, would be what is your barley field? What was the rotation last year? And then also, are there any target weeds in your area that you're particularly concerned about?
Yeah, so I did have canola on it last year, and I would say that kochia is kind of across the farm, so that's probably a main weed that we're running into, as well as some of the fields have more narrow-leaved hawksbeard than I'd like to see, as well as some wild oats.
So the canola last year, was it Liberty or glyphosate? And the reason I'm asking is because the Liberty is going to be better on the kochia and leave potentially some cleavers, depending on where you are. That's more of an issue up north. Whereas glyphosate, if you've got group 9 resistant kochia, the kochia could have potentially gotten away on you last year. So what kind of canola was on there the year before?
It was Victory, Cargill Victory canola.
Oh, that's a great variety. That's a great type. So being that it's a glyphosate tolerant variety, so if there are concerns about resistant kochia on that field, then I think a kochia targeted product this year probably would be a good option. So something preferably with some dicamba in it. There are a couple options that are out there. Corex is one that comes to mind. That's flurazolam and dicamba. So essentially pre-pass with dicamba in it. The other option would be DB878, which is a product from FMC. It's got tribenuron and thiophensulfuron as well as dicamba. So that's going to be a little bit stronger on the narrow-leaf toxbeard. One thing that I know I commonly see in the north is that the kochia up here doesn't really usually get going until a little bit later in the season. So often I find that if growers are spraying, mid-May or early May, they generally don't have an opportunity to get that kochia because we typically get a big flush sort of middle of June to the end of June. So that's definitely something to consider there as well. Doing an in-crop for the kochia might be a little bit more effective because it might be up more, but it just depends on where you are. I think further south the kochia tends to come a little earlier. So that's my 2 cents.
So I'm just thinking now, one of the fields would have been Liberty canola that we're renting this year. I think it was like L340. So in that case, do I need to switch up my pre-burn?
If you have had issues with cleavers in the past, it might be good to do something that has a cleaver option. Although there are good in-crops that also can help with cleavers in barley as well. Yeah, that's just something to be aware of. I know in the north we really struggle with cleavers, so it's always nice. They overwinter as well. So primarily with the pre-burn, we're targeting any perennial and overwintered weeds, and cleavers can really be nasty if the overwintered ones get going in season. They can be quite big by the time you get in for your in crop. So that would be something that I would consider there as well.
Okay, so if it was less kochia and maybe I did see some cleavers in that field, what would be your preference or suggestion?
I should have prepped this a little bit more. Anything that's got Arlex in it would be ideal. So now I'm trying to run through things in my mind. I believe
Paradigm.
Paradigm. That's what I was thinking.
Has Arlex.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's actually a good fit for the north because we tend to be a bit cooler in the spring and it's not affected by temperature. So that would be a good go-to. Yeah.
Thanks, Elite.
Yeah, sorry, Katie, I put you on the spot.
That product is like not necessarily a fit for everyone though, because Orlex products mean you can't grow lentils there next year. Just so everybody that grows lentils after their barley knows. Yeah, we tend to stick around that Corex, especially if it's on canola stubble, just because that Corex will offer that residual volunteer canola control. So it'll catch some of those flushing canola. And then, like Katie had mentioned, the dicamba for the kochia is really important to protect that glyphosate, and that flurazolam isn't going to do anything on the kochia. So I would say on canola stubble, Corex is a popular one just because it keeps our recropping restrictions open and it gets that volunteer canola.
Fantastic. Well, maybe on that note, so just what you guys have shared with me when I've went through what products I think are going to work. Cruiser Vibrance Quattro I'm going to stick with just because of that concern that I might have with wireworm. I'll maybe run with Corex, but also, understanding that, like you said, if I do have cleavers, maybe have to switch it up. I'm going to target around 2.5 bushels per acre when I'm buying my seed, but I'll definitely get the 1,000 kernel weight as you guys indicated. I'm going to try to get it in the ground first couple weeks of May. I guess maybe we'll just pause here if anyone does have any questions or comments from the chat.
Just been having a little bit of discussion around growing synergy for feed and or barley going on in the chat here. Nothing for the group just yet.
Great.
But if you do have a question for the group or just for us to answer in the chat, feel free to type it in there. We are keeping an eye on it. So.
All right, we'll jump next to important fertility considerations. And so I know this can be kind of a hot topic or one that there's a lot of different opinions upon. So I think it does depend maybe on your individual situation, but in this case, I guess for Barley Farms, we'll just, I guess, looking for some insight and input from our agronomy team around this topic. I think, Katie, you were going to kick this one off, hey?
Yeah, sure thing. So since we're growing barley for malt in this situation, we really need to keep an eye on having those proteins be relatively low. If we're doing if we're targeting feed, then obviously this isn't an issue, and you can put much higher rates of nitrogen, for example. But generally, when we're intending to keep protein low, keeping the nitrogen a little bit lower than we would for maybe like a wheat crop, for example, and sometimes rolling the sulfur back a little bit too can help to keep the protein low. The big determining factor, in my opinion, for this would be to like look at, what are the other crops on the farm typically doing? Do you generally have high protein in your wheat? Do you generally have high protein, like overall as an average across the farm? Maybe if you've got records from the last time you had a cereal on the field that you're intending to grow barley on this time, have a look and see what the protein levels were like then. Protein is a little bit variable, due to environmental conditions, absolutely. So just because you had really high protein there last time doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have really high protein this time, but it can help inform our fertilizer decisions, so that we can say, oh, hey, the protein here has been very low, over the last few years. Maybe it's not quite as a concern keeping those nitrogen levels down. But if you're in a field or an area that tends to have very high protein, then it's even more important to keep those the nitrogen levels down. So a general sort of rule of thumb nitrogen recommendation that I would make for a malt field, without looking at the soil sample first, would probably be around that 80 pounds. You can definitely safely increase that. I wouldn't go, much lower than that. You could decrease it a little bit if you're really concerned about it, but at that point, you're going to really start to give up yield. So I would call 80 pounds kind of like a benchmark, and then you can sort of adjust from there. Yeah, it's really, I'm a big fan of soil sampling. It's really nice if we can have a sample to go off. That being said, the nitrate results that we see on a soil sample, because it's measuring the nitrate portion of the nitrogen that's in the soil and not necessarily the entire all of the nitrogen that's in the field, that number can fluctuate depending on, for example, the temperature on the day that the soil sample was taken, even the time of day that the soil sample was taken. Did it get warm on the way to the lab? And different things like that can impact that number. So while I would consider that number when I'm making my decision, I wouldn't necessarily like entirely base the recommendation off of that. Yeah. So that's definitely something to consider. Sorry, can we go back to the, the one before too? Yeah, I think that nitrogen kind of is the biggest concern, I think, with malt barley. And I feel like keeping it around that 80 pounds is a pretty good benchmark. So that's where I would start for sure. Another thing to consider, since with malt barley, we don't have the option of using like a glyphosate, for example, at harvest time, because we're wanting to retain that germ, and glyphosate will disrupt that germ. So because of that, lodging can really be an issue in malt barley. And so there are a few nutritional tweaks that we can do to help prevent lodging in the field. For example, putting some potash down can really help. The potassium that's in it can be very beneficial to straw strength. Another thing is that in the north, we tend to see more copper deficiency. Generally, as we go further south in the province, we're more boron and zinc deficient. But I'm specifically mentioning copper because it's very important in straw strength as well. So if you're in the north, you can have a soil sample done to see whether or not your field is copper deficient. But it might be something that's worth considering using, for example, like a Procoat, which is a product that gets sprayed onto the fertilizer that can deliver, actually pretty substantial amount of copper for the crop. There are also, if you're further south and you think you might have a boron or zinc deficiency, there are kind of multi-nutrient options that have a few more nutrients in there as well, and generally pack a pretty good punch when it comes to copper as well. So there definitely are nutritional tweaks for that as well. Kira, I think you had some foliar fertilizer options that you were a big fan of down there, hey?
Yeah, okay, so down here we're a little bit dry. And so a big thing that we actually noticed was we were actually experiencing some like temporal potassium deficiencies. This is because in order for potassium to move to the root, it needs to move by either diffusion or mass flow, which is very water dependent. So in this situation, we were experiencing some potassium deficiency, and as a result, our plants weren't being as efficient as they could be with using their water and therefore like transporting their nutrients. So the way that we kind of addressed this is we found a foliar potassium product called Safe K. And we saw some really good results on barley. So this year, a lot of people are planning on using the Safe K. It resulted in a lot plumper kernels just because of that better water use efficiency more than anything. And this it could also be a fit for soils that are cold, because you'll also notice potassium deficiencies in colder soils as well. So that was a really popular one. And then there is a new one that actually has copper in it as well. If you don't get your fertilizer coated with the Pro Coat and you're still looking for that copper option, it's a product from Yara and it's called Multi-Cop. And so that one contains some macronutrients, and then it also contains some zinc, a little bit of boron, and then it also has that copper. So those are two ones that would definitely be a good fit on barley, Safe K and Multi-Cop.
Great.
Just
Thank
a
you.
quick sort of comment on potassium in general. Despite the fact that a lot of the time our soil tests will come back with very high or relatively high levels of potassium, we generally do have a fair bit of it in the soil, but there are, as Kira kind of alluded to, there are a lot of different factors that can make the potassium more or less available in the soil, and things like the chemical composition of the soil, and like Kira mentioned, the temperature as a couple examples. So having some readily available for the plant when it sort of starts to build those structural components is a really good way to ensure, kind of that the rebar goes all the way into the ground. Having some available, putting it down with a fertilizer or by using a foliar product, for example, is really important. Even though it is in our soil, there might be things that are stopping the plant from getting it. As Kira mentioned, it also requires water, so in dry conditions, it can be problematic. So just food for thought. Just because the soil test may say that there's lots there, it doesn't mean it's available when you need it, and putting some down can ensure that it is available when you need it.
And that is something that I had to learn this year when we are experiencing this really dry cycle, is like, how could we possibly have a potassium deficiency when our soil test levels look so good? And that was what it came down to, was just the really dry conditions, especially on the sandier soils. We were seeing that potassium deficiency across most crops.
Thank you. All right. I'm hearing that Modus is registered on malt barley. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Modus is a plant growth regulator from Syngenta, and it has been registered on malt barley for the 2021 season. So what Modus does, or what PGRs do, they actually help with lodging, right? And since you have selected Copeland as your variety of choice, this variety is actually fairly susceptible to lodging. So depending on your environmental conditions, if you have strong winds or rain, and based on Katie's recommendation, you're looking at anywhere from 80 to 90 pounds a N. So you're going to be pushing your nitrogen fertilization, and you're going to be increasing your seed rates. So having a plant growth regulator in your mix is going to be very important. So Modus is going to actually keep your barley shorter. It's going to lead to stem thickening. And then because the plants are shorter and they have thicker stems, the possibility of you having lodging is going to be reduced. What is very important is that your timing, right? So you're going to have to make sure that you're going in at a time when stem elongation is just beginning, so you can hit that barley at the right stage. So you're keeping the plants, or you're holding back the main stems so they're not getting too elongated, so you don't have like spindle plants. So the ideal growth stage for putting on Mudas is actually the 5 to 6 leaf stage. However, you can go up to flag leaf. And I had Mudas in a trial this past year. It was mixed with Trivapro, applied at the 5 leaf stage, and we saw significant control for lodging, right? So if you are on the call, like on the webinar itself, and you can actually see the slides. So to the right, you will see the part of the field that was treated with Mudas, and to the left, you see the untreated section. And in the untreated section, we had like significant lodging because the crop was so badly lodged. This affected combine efficiency and consequently led to a yield reduction. So having your crop standing is going to be very important, right? Because if it's standing up, then the possibility of you having those grains filled, and it's going to be easier for you to harvest. It minimizes the potential of you having any fungal diseases or sprouting if it's on the ground. And since you're targeting malt, having good quality kernel at the end of the day is going to be very key. So Mudas, that as it relates to tank mixing, you'll probably have to tank mix it with your in-crop, or you'll have to do a single pass, right? So that's how it's looking going forward. And it's going to be 0.42 liters per hectare. So it's going to be a cost-effective product. And based on all the field trials that have been done, it is very safe on barley, and there's always an increase in yield. The yield increase you're going to get is going to be dependent on probably where you are or just how well your crop performed on that given year. But market prices are good, and it will pay for itself at the end of the day. So
one question I have, if I can anticipate higher yields, would I also get lower protein?
yes, so the protein dilution effect will come into play here. So if you're anticipating higher yield, then it will reduce your protein. So that's going to be good. And also something that when we mentioned higher seeding rate earlier, so higher seeding rate can cause the crop to mature earlier, right? So it's standing and it can mature 2 to 3 days earlier. And this also can also lead to a lower protein or reduce your protein. So it's not standing too long. It doesn't take too long to be filled up or to dry out and stuff like that. So that's going to be important too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Janina, I think I'll just kind of maybe sum it up a little bit as like the point of Modus, I guess, would be, so if you are putting the groceries maybe to your barley and you are seeing that lodging, the Modus can really reduce that lodging. But like, could we actually rely on it as something that will dilute protein in all situations, or it's just if that yield is increased?
I'm going to say it's just if that yield is increased, yeah.
So would you see this as an opportunity to like pump more into your barley and then not have that fear of increasing the protein, or is that like maybe not that consistent?
I think probably going forward, that would be a way to look at it too, Kira, because to be honest, so Copeland is going to be yielding fairly good. As you said, if you're putting the groceries to it, then you're going to be getting yields comparable to what you would be getting for a feed variety. So worst case scenario, Janina, you don't get malt, then you'll have enough volume so that you can go in the feed market and you won't be operating at a loss.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah, great point.
I'd also keep in mind too, like the field history, like I was talking about a little bit with the other factors that can potentially contribute to protein. So if you've generally got really low protein overall already, then you might be safe to really pump the groceries to it and then use a PGR. However, if you're in a situation where you typically have really high protein to begin with, he might be playing with fire a little bit, using a really high fertilizer rate and hoping that the PGR will kind of like save you with the protein dilution effect, in my opinion.
Okay, well, a little bit to wade through there. Before I kind of decide, I guess, what I want to use, whether it's a PGR or not, some of this fertility stuff. Any watchouts, I think I'll probably be putting my phosphorus with the seed and putting my nitrogen in the mid-row. So any concerns around that?
Typically, that's a pretty safe arrangement. The seed safe threshold for phos on cereals is 50 pounds for phos that's going directly with the seed. So if you're not intending to exceed that 50 pounds, you're in good shape. The other thing that I would caution is if you're including some potash in your seed place blend, although I generally would recommend to put it away from the seed if possible. Sometimes mixing potash and urea isn't necessarily the nicest thing either. So, but with cereals, as long as the combined pounds of actual potash, not the pounds of product, the pounds of potassium, sorry, the pounds of potassium plus the pounds of phosphorus are underneath 50 pounds total, then you're still in good shape there. So generally, it's a high enough threshold that we don't often run into a lot of issues, but it is something to keep an eye on for sure.
Awesome. Okay, well, you guys have given me lots to think on this fertility space. So just quickly on this slide here, I am thinking to do a blend of potash and S15 that I'm going to treat with ProCoat just because of the soil test back there on the boron and the copper, as well as the zinc. I was a little bit lower. I guess boron I was all right. So it was the zinc and the copper. I don't think it's a bad idea to treat my fertilizer based on what you guys just shared with me. And then I'll be putting my nitrogen in the mid row. You can see here on the middle, it sounds like I'm meeting Katie's minimum of 80 pounds. In typically my neck of the woods on my wheat, I can say that we do have lower protein, or that's probably a challenge we run up against. So do feel like we can probably push those yields a little bit, push that fertility, like you said, the groceries to it. And then I'm hearing lots of good things around potash. So I'll include that in my blend, but also, like Kira indicated, the Safe K with drought concerns. I definitely want to consider that. One of the things I didn't include here under fertilizer, but we talked about, was Modus as a PGR. And I really like that idea of, hey, keeping my standability, reducing lodging, and hopefully my plant can reach its full potential. So I'll include it on our next step here when we're talking in-crop options. Any questions or comments before I jump to our next section here?
Just a quick little comment about your seed place blend. So you're doing S15 and potash going down with the seed. S15 is a little bit more seed safe than MAP, so we can even increase that rate just a little bit. And so just to be perfectly clear about it, that would be in the fertilizer analysis that's there. That would be like 30 plus 10 equals 40. So you're under that 50 pounds, so you're good to go.
Okay, great comments.
I would also just comment too, I like that you put the zinc on the fertilizer, because zinc doesn't really move in the soil. And so it really relies on root interception. So having that on the actual fertility near the seed will be quite important.
Fantastic. Pest management. So I started off on the right foot with the right fertility, the right seed, and treating it. So now I'm just wondering what I need to worry about or think about in crop. And I know we're approaching 10 to 10, so I don't want to rush you guys, but we'll maybe go through this in about 5 minutes if we can.
So I do a lot of recommendations for chem for barley, because we grow a fair bit of it up here. So in general, sort of like one-liners for each of these in-crop options. Obviously, with the grassy component, we're quite limited in barley. There are not a lot of options. This is pretty much it on this list here. So Puma, I would say in my area at least, is a less popular option because it has the potential to be a little bit tougher on the crop. It can cause some flashing in the barley, and so it just, it turns yellow and looks kind of sick for a few days. It generally bounces back quite well. But there are a lot of growers who just don't like that look. Also, it's kind of older technology, and so there are definitely places where resistant wild oats, for example, are an issue. I would say kind of a similar thing with Achieve. I don't have a lot of it going out. In my experience, there can be some tank mix complications depending on what you're intending to mix it with. The label will let you know, whether it's mixable or not. But it seems to me like as I'm looking for tank mix partners, there are a lot of lists that it says do not mix with Achieve, and that'll be the only watch out. So just something to be aware of with that. Axial, I would say, is definitely the most favorite. I know there are a few other options for pinoxidin now that it's come off trademark, but I do find like the formulation and stuff with Axial tends to be really good. Yeah, we don't tend to experience a lot of flashing or anything like that with Axial. I would say that rotation is really important when you're considering your options for barley. So there's not really any reliable way to get volunteer wheat out of barley, because everything that we can use on barley, we can also use on wheat. However, it's not the same, switch. There are, for example, if we're growing wheat and we have barley volunteers, we can use a group 2 like Varo or Simplicity or something like that to get the barley out of the wheat. But if we attempt to grow barley on wheat stubble and have wheat volunteers, there's nothing that we can do to get rid of them. So that's a really important watch out. Other than that, the broadleaf options that are available for barley are quite wide. Again, a good rule of thumb, always check and follow the label, but a good rule of thumb is that if you can use it on wheat as a broadleaf product, you can generally use it on barley. Again, it's always worth double checking, but there is a really wide variety of options. When we had talked about your farm earlier, Janine, you said that kochia was a concern. So for an in-crop, I would recommend something that's got fluoroxypure in it. That's going to be really, good on the kochia. And the first thing that comes to mind is that Axial Extreme is pinoxidin and fluoroxypure. So the pinoxidin is the group 1 graminicide, and the fluoroxypure is going to get your kochia. That would be a really good starting point. But you always want to mix another broadleaf option with your Axial Extreme, just because fluoroxypure, while it's really good on kochia, it has a relatively narrow weed spectrum, so there will be potentially some things that it misses.
She also has narrow-leaved hawksbeard, so Axial will allow you to mix a group 2 in, which the group 2s are really good on hawksbeard. So I think like an Axial Barricade would also be a good option, or Axial Stellar.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all those options, but also something that Katie said when she mentioned the flashing from the Puma, like in the north, we can see pinoxidin banding if it's very cold. So if it's very cold and you spray Axial, you can see some slight yellowing in your crop. So that's something that you can look for too. But Axial is probably the most common product used, an Axial Extreme or an Axial IPAC. But I'd say Axial Extreme, that all-in-one product, would be a very good fit for your area. Or Resivant, which is also a group 1 and a group 4, is also like a very good product that you can use as well.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, when it comes to fungicide, I hear lots of comments made around spraying at flagleaf, and then other comments and people strongly feeling around heading. So would you guys mind just sharing, in my mind, I think I'm only prepared to spray once a fungicide. When should I be spraying?
I like flagleaf time, to be honest, but we're not in a high like fusarium risk area consistently, and results with fusarium timing on barley has been kind of mixed because it flowers as it's coming out of the boot. So I typically recommend flagleaf fungicides because I see a good bushel increase from it. I find barley is really responsive to it, and so I usually do the flagleaf and then I mix my Safe K in with that application.
I prefer head timing just because we're in the north and we're in a wetter area, and if you're going for malt, you have to be concerned about what your dawn levels are going to be, right? So unlike barley, as Kira said, yes, it's going to be flowering in the boot, but if you have your timing correct to put on your fungicide, then it's going to be like a best bet option, right? So when you go in at head timing and you hit that barley just as it's probably 70% out of the boot, you watch, and as soon as you see those spikelets starting to emerge just above the boot, you start checking depending on temperature conditions, and then once you hit it at that correct stage, that's going to be like very good. And what the flag leaf, what the head timing fungicide does too is it also controls leaf diseases that may set in later, right? So you watch the what the weather condition is doing, as well as what your rotation is like, what crops you had before, what you're going to be putting there next year, and getting ahead of that fusarium is going to be a very good thing. And my favorite product for a head timing product is Bayer's Prosaro. I think it's a very good product. It works very, very well. It's a group treats and older chemistry, but I have consistently seen year over year positive results in using that on barley.
I'm a fan of Prosaro. I'm a fan of Prosaro in general too, up here, just because it's got the protection from fusarium head blight, but it's also got some protection from leaf diseases, which I think is really good. I'm on team head timing, but I will say that I think it's been mentioned already. That the timing on barley can be really difficult, and if you miss that head timing window and you haven't done a flag leaf application, then you can really get in a tight spot. So I would say I really believe in the head timing application. However, it's important to be really kind of committed to getting it. Like this isn't, oh, we're gonna go to the lake for a week or two and maybe we'll get it when we come back. If that's the attitude, and that's okay, but if that's your attitude, then a flag leaf timing option is much better. If you're able to really sit and watch that crop, because it'll turn, you get a good hot afternoon, and that's all the time it takes to have missed that window. So if you're going for head timing, which personally from an agronomic perspective I prefer, and maybe that's a northern perspective or whatever too, but you really have to be dedicated to be willing to watch that. And then I guess the other thing too is if you have a lot of acres of barley that was all seeded right around the same time, it may not be feasible to hit the timing window just right on all of those acres. So maybe there's a little bit of a maybe we do a bit of flag timing on some and head timing on the best fields that we're really dedicated to watch and we think have the highest yield potential, just as an example of a way that you could manage that. But yeah, the timing is so crucial that I think if you are going to go for head timing, you really have to be committed to getting it right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Katie, like 100%. Like, even if you're going for flag leaf timing, you also have to be timely too, because unless your field is like very uniform, if you go in too late, then having that group 11 in there also run the risk of increasing your dawn level. So that's also a watch out. But if you had to twist my arm, well, even if you didn't twist my arm, I'd prefer a head timing fungicide as opposed to a flag leaf. Or markets are good, and if weather conditions are bad, like it's a particularly wet year, then you could do a 2-pass system, right? You could go flag leaf and then hit it back again at head timing.
Well, those are all great comments. I think what I'm hearing, and whether it's Kira, Lalit, but I think Katie, you really summed it up well. That I guess if we can hit it at heading, especially if we are more in northern geographies getting a lot of moisture, that might be something to look at. If we're drier, maybe we haven't had challenges with fusarium, maybe to look at a flag leaf. In fairness, as an agronomist, I definitely am team flag leaf, and Lalit and I had a bit of a heated debate about this the other day, which I found very entertaining. So I did actually on this put Triva Pro, which is a flag leaf product at 6 leaf. So I think that's what we're going to run with, but I think that's a good point, Katie, maybe to try some at heading with a Prosaro, for example, might not be such a bad idea. One of the things that we had talked about earlier was around Motus. And so I guess what I'm hearing is that we can spray Motus with our flag leaf product, but I guess on that field that I'm going to spray with heading, Prosero at heading time, I'm assuming that I'd probably have to spray that a bit earlier, hey, with my in crop. And then we have Axial Extreme in here for in crop. So like Katie had said, Extreme is the Fluroxypure. I don't think we put it on here, but I don't know, Katie, if you had mentioned it earlier, just around MCPA, we'd probably want to put as well, hey?
Yeah, I would say though, if you do have narrow-leaf toxbeard, and depending on what okay, so we were doing Corex for a pre-burn, that'll have some activity on narrow-leaf toxbeard, but it's possible that if there's big overwintered narrow-leaf toxbeard, if you were to miss it with the pre-burn, then you might want something that's a little bit more of a heavy hitter on the narrow-leaf toxbeard. And I really liked Kira's suggestion about like Barricade. Any of the really sort of the FMC family of products is typically pretty good on narrow-leaf toxbeard, and really any group 2 is quite good. So using a Stellar would be an option as well. That's got the flurazolam component. However, then you're doing flurazolam twice in the same year, which I'm not a huge fan of necessarily. But depending on how bad the narrow-leaf toxbeard pressure is in that field, I would recommend you getting some thiophene and tribenuron. Those are those FMC chemicals in there at some point, whether it's in the pre-seed or in the in crop. Adding MCPA is definitely an option that will increase the weed spectrum a fair bit and really have a lot of activity on some of the smaller seeded annual weeds and things like that. But narrow-leaf toxbeard is a little bit of a difficult weed to handle. So if that particularly is a concern, then using a group 2, particularly those FMC products, is really my preference for sure.
Okay,
yeah, and I can just add one thing to that just before we jump into harvest. So like in my geography, I have growers who have cockle and nightfly and catchfly. And I find if you tank mix with a Bucktril M, then that also works to give you very good control. So Axial Extreme and Bucktril M for people in the north who have cockle or flower and catchfly, then that's also an option. Yeah.
Or buckwheat. That's really good on buckwheat.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think Eric was going to maybe speak to this a little bit, but just some considerations at harvest. We probably don't need to talk too much about this, but Eric, do you just want to comment on some of these points, and if anyone else on the call does want to talk as well?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes down to harvest and trying to get accepted for malt barley, the two biggest factors that you're going to run into are moisture and temperature of the grain that's coming off. Those are two biggest factors that are going to affect your germ and how long your germ can expect to hold, which gives you more opportunity to stay in the market for a longer period of time. When it comes to harvesting early or a little bit later, dealing with a little bit of green or some staginess in the crop, I really look at the weather. If we got rain in the forecast in 2 days from now and we got a little bit of green, go get it. Stick it on air and that green will turn into a thin, and it's something that we can work with. We get rain on barley. It has a tendency to chit and sprout very easily. All of these varieties have been bred to germinate on a dime of moisture because we need to germinate them in order to malt them. So obviously it creates a bit of an efficiency for maltsters. Unfortunately, it also does put us at risk when it comes to managing that crop, or even we get heavy dews and stuff like that. We can start to see chit levels start to ramp up fairly quickly. Those would be probably the two biggest watchouts that I would throw out there. But if anybody else wants to add anything, that's fine as well.
Yeah, I'll maybe just comment. I think that's a really good point that you made about these varieties generally will chit on, what was it, on a dime of moisture. That's exactly it. And so I think something that we deal with a lot in the Northwest is that we tend to have a fair bit of lodging. It just happens. And I think we've talked about it a lot over this call, so I won't really kind of like dive into detail. But the issue that we run into sometimes is when we have lodged crops, and there's enough moisture, a dime's worth of moisture. It really doesn't take much to get them to kind of sprout again. We get sort of that second growth. that can be really problematic in a field where we can't use glyphosate to take care of it. So it definitely is something to consider. Ideally, dealing with potential causes of lodging earlier on by having a really solid fertilizer plan, potentially using a PGR or something like that can help a lot to avoid being in that situation. But unfortunately, it is something that we tend to see almost every year. I've got fields that we're dealing with like that, and really in that situation, the only solution is to swath it. And so that can take sort of more time, and depending on the forecast, like Eric said, if we have a cool, wet fall, that can be a little bit problematic. So it just is definitely something to think about, and you might want to have some kind of harvest considerations about that. What does this look like if we have to swath it? What does like don't I guess what I'm trying to say is don't necessarily assume that you'll be able to straight cut it. Yeah, at least in the Northwest. Maybe in the South it's a little bit different, but I know it's something that we struggle with every year.
Okay, and then I'll just add, and then I'll jump to the next slide here, just on drying conditions. I have heard that with malt barley to not affect the germ, low and slow is kind of the best strategy if you're putting it through a dryer.
Absolutely. If you're going to be putting this stuff through a dryer, you got to run on low temperature. Otherwise, you can cook the germ right out of it. And I've seen that happen in the past where guys have taken it down to 12 or 11 and a half. Just kind of forgot about it, or hitting it with a little bit too high heat, and all of a sudden you'll have something that was germing at a 98 come back with a 62, and then it's no longer suitable for malt barley. So,
yeah, great. Okay, Eric, did you want to comment on this chart at all, just on storage and percent moisture, that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is just a chart that I've used. Actually, I got this from one of my growers probably about 5 years ago now, and I think it just kind of highlights how important, like I said, moisture content and temperature of the barley is when considering how long your germ can last. I mean, even when you look at something at 18%, I mean, we can still get over half a year if that barley is really nice and cold. But I mean, as you see, as you start to increase the temperature and you start to increase the moisture content, the amount of time that we can expect that germ to hold, it really starts to decrease.
Great. Okay, maybe just to wrap up the agronomic component, just around this harvest condition. So, I think at this point I'll plan to swath my crop when we do have that warm, dry window, and combine and get that off the field as quickly as we can. Just as a reminder, 13.5% moisture is dry for malt barley.
Sorry, just one more real brief comment about lodging. I feel like I've talked about it a lot, but it is definitely a concern. When crops are lodged, obviously it takes a lot longer to get them off the field. The combine efficiency goes way down. So that's just one other reason why it might be beneficial to think about using a PGR, or have a real close look at your nitrogen or at your fertilizer package, because if you can just keep cruising along, you can get things off within that warm dry window, whereas if you're going a lot slower, it can be problematic.
Yeah, even a mile an hour slower on 500 acres, that can really add up, hey? All right, marketing considerations. Eric, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, sure. I haven't seen the slide move, but when it comes to marketing considerations, I guess for malt barley, the biggest thing that I'll be talking about is obviously the supply and demand issues that we're running into in Canada, and demand out of China. So those would be probably the two biggest things that I focus on, as the vast majority of malt barley that's grown in Canada either goes into domestic production or goes into China. So right now, if you take a look at these numbers here, just looking at the 2021 year, we actually saw domestic feed use drop this year, and the reason for that is when you look at the ending stocks, they're projected 804,000 metric tons, under 1 million metric tons. That's a very, very tight carryout, and it's spread kind of all over Western Canada and even into Ontario a little bit. So it's what they've essentially run into is they can't find it. That's why we've seen some of the domestic feed demand go to the wayside. When you look at food and other, that is domestic malt production or domestic pearling production. So when you look at that, that demand is very, consistent. And when you look at barley exports, this is the big number here, where we've really seen the number increase from 2019, 2020 through to a projection of essentially doubling our exports on barley into China over the next couple of years. So flip over to the next slide here. Yeah, so this is just a little bit of data on where China has been buying their barley from, and so I think it just kind of goes to highlight how variable it can be. But what we did see kind of 2014, 2015, if we look at the bottom at the totals there, was hog production really ramped up in China, and they really started to increase the amount of barley that they were bringing in, whether it be for malt or for feed. We've also seen the middle class in China grow consistently over the last 10 to 15 years, and so malt demand has increased in China as well. Another thing to note here is when we look at where China is buying their barley from, the closest geographical point is Australia. Right now, China and Australia are embroiled in a fairly substantial trade war, where we're seeing 75 and 80% tariffs on barley coming out of Australia into China as an import tariff on the Chinese buyers. So they're essentially looking basically anywhere else in the world that they can find barley outside of Australia. And you can see that number really started to dip in 2018. 2019, we're starting to hear some rumblings about this trade war starting to hit. The can got kicked down the road to May 2020 for a decision to be made, and it actually wasn't finalized until November of 2020. And when we look at that 1.49 million metric tons of barley that came out of Australia and went into China in 2020, the vast majority of that would have been before June of 2020 or before May of 2020. And essentially the demand has to be replaced somewhere else. So Canada is a place that China is continuously coming back to and buying more and more barley. And the other one to note is the Ukraine. Ukraine or Black Sea region typically does not ship a lot of barley into China, or hasn't in the past. But with Australia not being able to fill Chinese demand, China has gone back to the Black Sea in a big way and has really started to ramp up in imports out of that region. Next slide. This again just kind of goes to highlight where the barley is coming from. So I mean, when we look at Australia, normally we would see vast majority of Australia's barley production would be heading into China from an export standpoint. Right now, where we are seeing a lot of it going into is into other Southeast Asian markets, namely Malaysia, and then as well as into the Middle East. And that Middle East demand, it was something that was typically filled by Ukraine in the past. And so Australian barley is actually at anywhere between about $40 to $75 a ton discount, depending on where it is heading compared to what Canadian barley is being sold for into China right now. And China is essentially trying to grab it from everywhere else in the world, whether they're pulling it out of Argentina, they're pulling it out of Canada, they're pulling it out of Europe, they're pulling it out of the Black Sea. So the concern is that if Australian barley can start to compete for market space back into China, that we could see prices start to erode as Australia can start to fill that demand at much cheaper freight rates, and then it would force us to actually have to look for alternative markets as well that are paying at a discount to what China is. But this import tariff has been placed on Australian barley for upwards of the next 4 years yet. So, I mean, we all know politics can change day to day, but this is kind of where we stand right now, and this is how the market has changed. So, maybe head over to the next slide there. So again, like I said, I'm just going to talk about China. Demand for malt in Canada is relatively inelastic. We have our own own domestic malt production, and we haven't really seen a whole lot of impact in demand. We have seen demand maybe back off a little bit in malt in North America, just with COVID hitting, where we've had some, stadiums are shut down, restaurants are closed. Typically, you'll see higher levels of beer consumption in public venues, but at the same time, we haven't really seen a significant drop in demand. Malt demand is fairly inelastic. So China is going to be the big player here. And I did talk a little bit already about the trade war between China and Australia, and that's essentially what's propping up our barley prices right now. Like after after 5 to 6 years of releasing corn stocks, and soybean stocks for that matter, China has really been selling a lot of their surplus over the last 5 years back into global markets, primarily into Africa and into the Middle East. And then what happened is we had COVID hit. And so not only are they trying to ramp up their production, but they're also trying to rebuild their surpluses and rebuild their stockpiles. So essentially what I call this is a little bit of COVID hoarding. But I mean, there is a bit of a mentality right now when you have a pandemic that if you own the food, you own the power. And so China has been trying to buy everything that they can possibly get their hands on. The other thing is that African swine flu has been a major problem for the Chinese in their pork production for the last couple of years. And over the last 6 months or last 9 months, they've kind of got the general feeling is that they've got it under control, and they're actually really starting to ramp up their hog production again in a big way. When we talk about hogs in China, we're talking about numbers that are comparable to Canada, the US, Mexico, and Brazil combined for hog production. So it is very significant demand. That's driving imports of corn, that's driving imports of feed barley, and that is what's essentially propped up the price of everything. Right now they're importing canola, importing soybean. Chinese demand is essentially what's propped up the price, and everything has gone up by anywhere from 25 to 50, or in some cases 75% in prices, depending on what commodities that you're looking at. One other note was last year there was poor crop conditions in China. Last year, there is drought concerns in the Black Sea region again this year, as well as, frankly, here, the U.S. There's Australia had a big crop last year, but they don't have that market access into China right now. So outside of that, there is definitely some concerns going forward. Stocks are very tight, and the demand is definitely there. We'll talk about the bears next, I guess. Yeah, like I said, when it comes to bears, malt demand is relatively inelastic. So essentially, what's going to drive the price here on malt barley is corn and is feed imports into China. And like I had also said, COVID has dampened the demand for malt barley, but not in the way that we probably expected. I mean, if you'd have talked to me last year in March or April when we were first locking everything down, there was a general consensus that we'd see malt barley demand to drop by 30 to 40%. The numbers are nowhere near that. Anecdotally, I would say from talking to some of our merchants and some of our experts, we feel that malt demand globally is maybe down around 10%. What we've seen is that the consumption hasn't necessarily changed. The venue for consumption definitely has, but the consumption levels have not decreased in a way that we originally anticipated. So I mean, it is bearish. I mean, if we continue to see COVID around and it continues to rear its ugly head, whether it's new variants or whatever, and we continue to be forced to shut down some of these venues, it is a bear in the market, but it's not a significant downside. The thing that concerns me right now is the feed to malt spread. When you look at a feed to malt spread that's tightened up so significantly where we're at, there isn't a big premium right now for malt barley over what you can get for feed. I mean, I've had conversations with guys where they took off their malt last year and it was testing 14.8 or 15 moisture. A lot of that malt essentially went to the feed market because when you factored in drying discounts to take it down to a 13.5 for malt or dry at 14.8 for feed, the cash value was the same, and they didn't have to worry about any of the other specs with malt barley either. So and probably got a little bit quicker movement. My fear is that if we do start to see corn prices slip or we start to see feed barley slip, malt is overpaying essentially right now. Maltsters, in order to get their hands on barley, are having to pay some sort of premium to feed in order to buy it, and essentially they're paying at levels that they really don't want to be. In all honesty, malt is a little bit overpriced. So my feeling is that if feed drops, we won't see the spread between malt and feed necessarily widen out to that buck or $1.25 a bushel. We'll probably see the spread hold, and malt will probably fall with it. The other concern right now is, and again talking on the bullish side where we're turning on hog barns in China, is we are starting to hear some more reports on African swine flu rearing its ugly head again in China. And if we have to go through another round of killing off essentially massive amounts of pig herds, that is definitely going to hurt some of the demand into China. And if the demand into China for feed grain starts to die off in some way, shape, or form, we're basically going to be forced to look at alternative markets again. And I mean, we saw that with canola a couple of years ago, where when we can't move stuff into China, we're moving it into other markets at a discount to those markets. And then we're essentially going to be forced to compete with an Australian crop that we frankly don't want to have to right now. So those are probably the biggest things that are going on in the malt market or the barley market as a whole. Ultimately, I'm optimistic. We're looking at new crop prices right now at $6 or $6.25 for malt barley. For an October November movement period, we're seeing feed prices anywhere from $5 to $5.50 in the fall and into the early winter months for new crop as well. We know that we're going to be really, really tight on stocks going forward into next year. Production's going to be the driving factor. Production and quality, ultimately. If we have poor quality, it's tough to find malt markets for it. But fortunately, if we still have that feed demand and we can keep these hogs rolling in China, it's a party right now. We're seeing record high prices, and it doesn't look like we're going to see any reduction in demand. I mean, unless all of these things come together at once. So we are in the middle of a pandemic. There are fiscal policies being changed by major global nations. It seems like almost every day to try and tell you where I think this market is going to go. My crystal ball is broken. I have no idea where this is going to go. But right now there are definitely some really nice prices out there. So with that, if there's any questions for me or any of the rest of the panel as well, we can definitely take those.
Right. Well, if there isn't any questions, do want to thank everybody who's joined the call today. I know we did schedule this extra time, so we wouldn't be rushed. I'm glad we did do that. Again, for anyone who has questions on marketing their malt barley crop or agronomically what they should be doing in their area specific to their farm, our team is here to help. So reach out to your sales rep, reach out to your agronomist, and yeah, we're happy to have those conversations so we can walk through. Have a really good rest of the day, everyone, and yeah, we'll hopefully talk soon. I don't know the next time we'll see each other.